Welcome. This is Lisa Cuquier with Business of Family. This is our sixth episode of Business of Family. And I'm here with two wonderful guests, Caitlin Husserow and Caleb White from CFAR. We're talking today at the Business of Family webinar about multiple generations and how we manage unforeseeable risks and disruptions that have happened. We have seen an incredible amount of resilience over the past 15 years. I think we're all tired of talking about the pandemic, but it really left an indelible mark for us. It really told us all that we're able to pivot and shift and that we're able to manage disruption for the most part, but it's not without a lot of advisors helping to manage those difficult moments. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. You know, having multiple generations participate in a family business brings vibrancy of ideas, solidarity, profound connection, shared purpose. We'll be hearing about some of that today from Caitlin and Caleb as they discuss mission and values and core principles, the statements and the governance that holds a family and an enterprising family together. It's hard to replicate that in a non-family enterprise. It really sets family businesses apart from your average everyday business. On the other hand, though, the interconnectedness of familial relations really creates hurdles that are unknown to your average business otherwise. Family businesses are only as resilient as the family members and family governance. The benefit that family businesses have above and beyond other businesses is an innate and profound shared interest in its own survival. This is not like a typical business where you have employees and a separate management company or ownership. This is a real enterprise, a family enterprise that's a shared enterprise together. With that, I would like to briefly introduce my guests, introduce myself, introduce the firm, and then turn it right over to Caitlin and Caleb to introduce themselves in greater detail. Caleb White is a principal at CFAR and a market leader for the family business and family office market. Caitlin Husserow is senior manager at CFAR, working with the next generation members in family offices and family enterprises. I am Lisa Cuquier. I'm a family law attorney. I practice not only typical family law issues such as prenuptial planning, marital planning, divorce, and also trust planning, trust management, trust litigation if it needs to be, and I protect families from internal strife and family litigation with a family advisory practice. Our firm, Burns & Levinson, manages family office matters. We have two very integral components. We have the portion that relates to corporate law and business law, as well as the portion that relates to the private client group. And within that, we're able in a full service firm to leverage our collective expertise and protect our family offices in terms of their family law issues, as well as their business law issues. So without any more delay, I'd like to turn it right over to Caleb White to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Lisa. A pleasure to be here. I bring sort of two hats to this kind of a conversation. One is the work that I do at CFAR as market leader, as you mentioned. We've been supporting family enterprises for over 40 years. We came out, the firm first started at Wharton and really is at the intersection of hard and soft, helping a lot of family businesses, as you pointed out so well in your introduction. When the stakes are high, as they are in family businesses, trying to get the family dynamic right while also preserving the economics, whether that's in the family office or in the family business, is so critical. In addition, I myself am sixth generation of a 185-year-old family business, Ensign Bickford. So part of what I'll be able to bring to the conversation today is that perspective. And I'd like to also introduce my colleague, Caitlin Husserow. Over to you,
Yeah,
Caitlin.
so I'll jump in now. So hi, I'm Caitlin Husserow. I'm a senior manager at CFAR. As Caleb mentioned, we're a firm that works with family enterprises and family offices, and we've been doing so for a really long time, since almost the beginning of the field. I think at the beginning of the field, our colleague Nancy Drozda was really involved in that. And we've been part of working with families for a while now. We've had the opportunity to interact with Burns Levinson and with Lisa and her colleagues, which has been really great, and really excited to be here today. I think we're working with families that are, navigating complex intersections between their roles and the businesses, and the challenges and opportunities that show up in all those places. I think I personally work a lot with the next generation, and we work on multi-generational teams. So we work often with both the next and the leading gen. And so it's really been fun to partner with Caleb and others on my team on the internal side, and people like Lisa on the outside, and really help partner to make our client situations even better. So.
Good. Yeah, that partnership is critical. What that creates is a continuum throughout the generations and a continuum of business. We saw how important that was during the pandemic. I know that we're also tired of the pandemic. We're all getting vaccinated and wanting to get out there back into life, but it's all going to look very different. I think that over the past 15 months, we've learned that we can do things differently. We've seen a lot of the ability of businesses, family businesses, to be resilient and to be very self-protective at a moment of crisis. It's left an indelible mark in all of the generations, the baby boomers, the Gen X's and the millennials, and so on. And so I can see how the work that you're doing to try to bridge gaps between the leading generation and the younger generation is quite so important, especially at a moment when we're dealing with a disruption that was not foreseeable. And that's exactly the topic that we have today, is how do we protect family offices from these risks that you don't foresee? So Caleb, tell me, what have you observed in your work with family offices over the past months in terms of family resilience? Have certain family offices managed and persevered better? And what have you encountered? What's been a recipe for success, and where has it been tricky?
Great. Okay, Lisa, thanks for the question. I think, while every family has been different, and whether it's family offices or family businesses, what we have found is that resilience is certainly apparent, and whether the business is a second generation business or a sixth generation business. And one of the things that we saw first and foremost is that the disruption of the pandemic really brought generations together quickly. Things like Zoom made that easier, less travel made that easier, but where we saw greater success was when families could come together and get out of firefighting mode and step back and remind themselves, well, what are our values that have brought us here? What have been the things that have been key to our success up to the time of the pandemic? And having conversations about their values and how they want to treat employees and how they might need to innovate to be able to pivot. And one example I can share, one business fundamentally lost all of its commercial aircraft business for the near term because, of course, nobody was traveling. That same business was able to pivot and start providing key components to ventilators. And so fundamentally, we're able to move from one absent business into a very new business for them, an adjacent business for them, and the kind of message that sent to their employees about being part of the solution to the pandemic was profound. Another business lost 80% of its revenues almost overnight. But again, we're able to sort of figure out, well, how with the new technologies do we accelerate things that we thought would be 5 years from now, but started happening, 2 months later. So it's really that value of innovation and almost a confidence that we've been here before and can move forward that we saw really help businesses. But Lisa, what did you see? Because I certainly know you've been busy both in 2020 and in 2021, so it seems nonstop.
Yes, it has been. And I'm really intrigued by the stories that you've just told of the incredibly innovative and industrious pivots that were made by family businesses and shifting to moving ventilators and transporting ventilators rather than people at a time when people were not going to be taking planes. So that's a very incredible story. On the other side of that, I saw some family businesses in hospitality that had a very difficult time. Some of the family businesses in hospitality were able to shift into a takeout mode, a delivery mode. We saw some changes, some big changes that way in the delivery of hospitality services and goods to homes. I think Wayfair had its best year ever, and there were a lot of different signs that was happening, but there were some businesses that had a very difficult time. I think it was hardest for those family businesses that had an emotional problem, an emotional situation within the family at the same time. They were not as fluid in their ability to weather the disruption of the pandemic. So, for example, I represent several individuals who are going through divorce. And at the time that they came to me pre-pandemic, their business was vibrant. And because of the divorce and the emotional impact of that, they were not in innovative mode. They were not in industry mode. It was a different mindset. And so the shifting and pivoting that many family offices that were healthy and that were vibrant, that kind of pivoting didn't happen for some of those other businesses because there were emotional, internal problems and turmoil going on that really absorbed the bandwidth of many of the members in the family. And as a result, those businesses lost some value. And so in some of those divorces where we started off with an abundance mentality, knowing that everybody would be okay and that we could take a more elegant approach to this and have it just run smoothly, instead, it turned into fears of scarcity. Even though scarcity wasn't truly part of the equation here, these issues turned into illiquid divorce and the needing to find new solutions to separate financial and personal business interests and relationship interests. And so it created new challenges, there's no doubt. Another thing that I saw is a lot of marriages got delayed, they got postponed, or they went from being these big destination weddings that were supposed to happen in the summer of 2020, when all the venues shut down, they turned for the most part into backyard weddings. So the weddings occurred, which is wonderful, but the planning that went into weddings traditionally didn't happen. And some people, as a consequence, got married without prenuptial agreements. So now I'm dealing with sort of the correction, the retrospective correction, if you will, where I'm now drafting some postnuptials to make up for the fact that there was no prenuptial drafted a year ago today. So I have seen absolute impacts to this, both good and bad. But one of the good impacts that I've seen is that, family businesses did do some shifting. I think we realized that we're able to work from home. The whole concept of going back to the office for a 5-day week has changed. And our balance of work life and family life has changed. And the family has reached a more important pedestal in the way that we move forward and the way that we work. And I think that has been ultimately a significant silver lining to the pandemic. Caitlin, how about you? How have you dealt with this and what have you seen over the past 15 months?
Sure. I guess from my perspective, working mostly with the next generation in some of these families, I think they've taken on a unique role in as innovators in some ways and as participants in some of the roll up our sleeves and let's do this together work. So it's been really interesting to see people kind of come into their own, into their leadership, to take up roles, to build credibility in this time. It's been hard work. It's been stressful. There's been a great deal of uncertainty and it's hard to plan for the future when there's that, looming cloud of who knows. But I think it's been a great deep learning opportunity for people. At the same time, people have to take the time to do that learning, to make that happen during these times of crisis. And so one thing that we've really helped to kind of introduce into systems with families is a framework for pausing, for taking the time. There's this cycle, and two of our colleagues, Nancy and Debbie, recently did a Family Business Magazine webinar on a topic. It was actually like in the midst of the pandemic. So it was a different conversation. Now we're hopefully on kind of the outskirts of the impact. And so, but it's really applicable to all situations. I think there's natural and environmental realities that push up against families and their growth and make things more complicated, especially when you think about generational transitions. And so there's this resilient cycle of, act, learn, and adapt. And then go back to act and learn and adapt. And I think that continuous cycle is something that we've had to help families integrate into their process. I think as we all have experienced, people just went into action. They jumped right in and said, all right, let's roll up our sleeves, let's do this together. And they didn't necessarily always take out those moments to think, to reflect. And it resulted in kind of band-aids to problems. As Lisa, you mentioned, you just get married, you'll figure out the rest of the details later. They kind of just went with what would, fix the wound, and didn't really think about what was ideal, definitely in the long term, but even in the short term, what are the things they could be doing differently to really help in the situations they were in. And so I think we have plenty of examples of families that just went act, and now are like, oh no, I need to reflect on this process, and I need to make some serious changes because I know that there's so much rich learning in this crisis that's happened, but I haven't really been able to make use of it. And I think that's some of the work that we're doing now, is to help families take that peel back and hopefully in the future integrate more of a process of reflection into their work. So.
Yeah, the crisis, that crisis moment creates, the disruption, the unforeseeable impact creates this dysregulated moment. So how do you both help calm the situation enough to help the families that you're working with to resume the correct cycle of act, learn, and adapt? Because people really do, in a dysregulated moment, act, react, and they're not actually learning, adapting, and doing the debriefing that you're talking about. How do you stop it and calm it?
Well, it's not as easy as waving a magic wand, that's for sure. And there is a Venn diagram that's sort of fundamental to a lot of the work we do and the field does with family businesses. And that Venn diagram really has three circles. And one circle is family, and the other circle is the business, and the third circle is ownership. And as you were discussing earlier, Lisa, when the emotion, whether it's triggered by the pandemic or a black swan event like the pandemic, or it is just a long time emotion from the family side that starts bleeding into the business conversations and the business meetings on a daily basis. One of the things that we try to do to help families is really separate those areas of governance around the family, around the business, and around ownership. And yes, there is naturally some overlap, but the more we can keep those conversations apart and have sort of forums for each, we find that incredibly helpful. The other thing we encourage is to have families really understand through things like behavioral assessments of each other, right? Myers-Briggs or the predictive index, things like that allow us to understand, well, where is that person coming from? Is that just a generational thing? Well, maybe not. Maybe that's just the way that person is wired. And the more one does work with families ahead of high stakes emotional disruptions about, well, just how they interact, how they communicate, how they show up. And the more that's understood and that is practiced one-on-one and across, let's say, a team dynamic of a family office or a family council, the easier it is for people to be aligned and sort of understand where each other might have blind spots and how they might respond to high tension situations.
Very interesting that you use that testing as a mechanism, because that would probably be what would help in a situation where family members are polarized, or where generations are polarized on whether to act and move forward or step back. And this is exactly how family businesses differ from other businesses, because in a typical, business that's not a family business, you wouldn't do this kind of insightful testing and this insightful bringing of experience and psychological understanding
Right.
of how we navigate through crisis. You wouldn't do that with all the employees. But in a family business, you really do need to, because everybody is working together. And if you have polarization, it's probably going to create a greater disruption than the disruption that's happening from an external environmental force. So I can see how that would work.
And it becomes 24/7. It's not as though versus non-family businesses where when people pull out of the parking lot or get on the train, it can go away. Lisa, you had mentioned prenuptials and postnuptials as some of the things that you use as tools to help families. But what else, either in the pre-planning stage or sort of in response to things that have been the act mode, do you find that you're able to use in helping families?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like for my clients to come to me when they smell smoke, but before they smell flame, before they see flame. That's very important. So when things are feeling not right, when things are feeling uncomfortable or difficult, it makes sense to, at that point, come to see me. When there are brewing family rivalries, or when there is marital discomfort, or different issues that are coming up, perhaps discomfort between generations over an upcoming potential marriage, or trust planning, or whatever it might be, it makes sense to see me at that point. I have, in various situations, referred family members to therapists or to coaches or to consultants like yourself. I don't necessarily see all of these issues as legal issues, but at least I've got my eyes out for those red flags, and I know when it's time to take some strategic pre-disruption planning so as to batten the hatches. So one way that I would do this would be, clients sometimes come to me, they are dealing with some marital stress and marital strain, and they're not sure if the marriage is going to survive. They're feeling the forces that press on marriage. Marriage is, like all relationships and like life itself, is very delicate. And it's very susceptible to forces that press on it that may have nothing to do with trust, has nothing to do with love, has nothing to do with fault or blame. We saw that in bas relief with the pandemic. It took down relationships and made things very difficult for people in a million different ways. And that was nobody's fault. And so when I have a client who comes to me early on in the process with some marital discord, then what I can do is I can have an open and frank conversation about aligning actions around two parallel paths. So that on one hand, perhaps I'm saying to the client, get yourself into couples therapy. I've got a couples therapist. You are in this very typical limbo stage. You're not the first to be in this difficult limbo stage where you can't discern whether you want to stay or whether this isn't going to work. It's a very typical stage. And it's at that time that you can hold the marriage together, or that you need to act because it can't stay together. And one way or the other, something must be done in that limbo, because you can't do nothing at that time. It's too sensitive, too delicate, and too susceptible to injury when you're already in that place where there's marital discord and you're smelling smoke, but there's no flame. So at that point, it makes sense to start the couples counseling, the discernment counseling, whatever else is happening from all of those advisors who can help to keep things together, to keep the family together, to keep the marriage together. But at the same time, it also makes sense to be speaking with the leadership in the family about the what if and how can we do some planning to batten hatches just in case. And so it is very common for me to meet with people who are in that limbo stage long before divorce is ever uttered, and hopefully divorce will never be uttered. Hopefully there'll never be a divorce. But if there is, we have taken steps through prior generations, through the leadership, to change some trust interests, perhaps to do some decanting, perhaps to build in some marital exclusion language, and to batten hatches, because over the past 7 or 8 years, there has been such a cascade of cases that have been decided in Massachusetts and around the country that relate to the vulnerability of family trusts in connection with divorce claims and the equitable division of family assets in a divorce. So trusts are no longer necessarily immune because of a spendthrift clause. So it makes sense for me to do that planning with the leadership, but also to do some corporate law planning. And I've got my corporate law partners, and we take a look at this with our estate planning partners. We bring it together in a very unified multidisciplinary approach. We might make changes to corporate documents. Maybe we are changing some voting interests and where those shares are held. We might be changing some fiduciary control provisions. We may be changing some dispositive provisions of who gets what, if you will. And that way we can make the kinds of changes so that if, heaven forbid, the relationship doesn't work, the family and the family wealth is protected.
Very similar.
Yeah, go ahead, Caleb.
Yeah, very similar to that. I think one of the tools or one of the big pieces of advice we give families is the importance of outside advisors. And similar to some of the advisors you would recommend, whether it's therapists, family counseling. The other thing, particularly when they have an operating business, is the importance of having perhaps outside board members, whether that's an advisory board or a fiduciary board. And in times of crisis or in times of the need of mentoring around these kinds of issues, having an experienced board, having those who can sort of look at the situation without necessarily having the familial ties and the familial emotion can be incredibly important. Sorry, Caitlin, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I was going in sort of a different direction, but I think, Lisa, you talked about inaction and some of those critical moments. And I think one thing that we help raise to people, and I know we've done this, Caleb, through some work that we've done on scenarios, is that continuation in the same way is also a choice. And we raise that as a choice that you put on the table, in addition to other solutions that might be better for you. You know, continuation is action as well. And so yes, how can you kind of put those choices on the table and help families that are working together really see, you know, where they are and what their options are? Because sometimes you get stuck in the way things have been, and we all know that.
Absolutely. People tend to do what's reflexive for them. And what that means is that sometimes they use behaviors or they react in ways that they have adapted in the past to different threats and disruptions. And now, given the current circumstances, those adaptive behaviors and reactions are maladaptive under the new circumstances. And before you know it, you've got self-defeating behaviors. So that raises the question that I'd like to ask you is, how do you help your family members through the unthinkable? How do you help them out of maladaptive patterns? And is there some mission planning that you do with the families in advance so that you don't have to have your families that you're consulting for be stuck in self-defeating maladaptive patterns?
Okay, why don't you grab that first, and then I'll pick up right after that.
Sure. So I think we definitely help families keep their mission and their values and a vision for the future at the core. And so there's ways that we work that through across generations. Usually is helpful to figure out kind of what people are really driven towards in order to kind of ground and provide a foundation for behaviors in a lot of ways. And I think we help, what's your long-term purpose? What are the goals? What are the things that can help drive you towards where you want to be as a family? And those are across multiple dimensions. Obviously, what do you want to do to continue to grow the wealth of the business, the enterprise, the family office? And also, what are the things you're going to do to kind of keep your family together? And how important are each of those dimensions in your future? And so I think kind of creating a foundation and a grounding in those elements and those features really helps us kind of identify behaviors and help people make sense of why people are behaving in different ways and help kind of shape and sculpt the family towards what they want. So Caleb, what do you want to add here? Yeah,
one of the specific tools we use to get at a family's mission, vision, and values is a family constitution. And, as important as that is to, every family constitution, will be different by a family. So we'll first work with a family of what's your table of contents? What do you want it to include? And by the end, it might have things like employment policies. It'll have mission, vision, and values. It'll have, here's how we define family. Here's how we want communication to happen across the generations. But as important as the end product is, it's really the process of discussing these things together multi-generationally, bringing families together, understanding where there are differences, making the differences a positive and a strength of the family, rather than focusing on differences as a potential rift or a position that one group takes versus one branch might take versus another branch. So certainly family constitutions are important. And
just to add with Lisa in the room, those are non-legally binding. So these are things that are created as agreements between the family for the family, and can be adopted over the years, but really kind of provide the rules of the road, which we find, especially first to second, second to third, generational transitions become so helpful in helping people understand, how they show up and what the expectations are of them. And, what are the rules of the road? People really crave that information. And I know, Lisa, much of the work you do is in response to that craving. So anything to add, Lisa, on that? Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. I want to go a little bit deeper into that. So how do you help the next generation with that? I would imagine that to some extent they are acculturated to rely on the leadership and the generation ahead of them. How do you help them with that development orientation so that they have the mindset that they're participating in this now and not merely following the leadership and relying on the prior generations?
Yeah, so there's lots of different parts to this. So I'll start, and Caleb, feel free to kind of launch in here. But I think one of the most critical things is for the next generation to really surface their questions. What questions do they have on their mind? What do they know that they don't know? What don't they know that they don't know? And I think also, what assumptions have they made about what the future looks like? Because oftentimes people go down a path thinking, it'll just repeat itself the way it did before, or they just make assumptions, to be honest. And so how do you help kind of unpack what's beneath that and really help them figure out what they want? What do they want for the collective future of their generation? What do they want for their connection to other generations? What do they want in terms of continuity? Like I said, along the dimensions of continuity of the wealth and continuity of the family. And so how can they drive together towards those things? And also understand they have a responsibility and an obligation to that continuity. It's not something being done to them. They're really an active participant. And this is one of the places where we do a lot of work with families to help increase their engagement so that they can explore potential participation in parts of the entity, maybe as employment or in management or, as owners. And so how do we use these situations where people are having to answer pretty tough questions, to be honest, and make agreements together, and where there might not have agreement, in a way that helps build that muscle for the future. So in all of our next generation work, it's really with a developmental orientation to both getting the work done, of course, because that's part of the equation, but also building the capability of the next generation so that they can do stuff together and stuff that might even be harder than a family constitution, even though a family constitution is not easy. So I don't know if I answered all the questions, but Caleb, you want to add any of your perspectives? And Lisa, you probably have some too to share.
Well, certainly, Caitlin, that's well put. I think the only things I would add is so much of our work is trying to help families have those difficult conversations and creating the container that allows for the conversations to take place without collateral damage that's going to set the family back instead of being able to make it progress forward. So at the same time, you might be working with a next generation member. I might be working with the leading generation and reminding them how important it is to create the space and have them begin to think about their next chapter and maybe pull out of the day-to-day involvement and begin to give opportunity for the next generation. But I'd be interested, Lisa, when you're dealing with sort of multi-generations, what are some of the things that you and your Burns and Levinson colleagues do to try to make it a generative conversation, not just a high stakes emotional one?
Yes, this happens to be prenuptial season right now. We're in May. And so I happen to be working on a lot of prenuptials. I'm also working on some trust decanting issues and looking at family trust. And what I'm doing lately, a lot of, is looking at the trust interests of the leading generation and looking at prenuptial planning for the next generation. The conversation between the two starts off a little bit polarized, even when people have been acculturated to know that they're going to college and they're going to have a prenuptial when they get married, because families now are starting to have that conversation early on. It's not brought up in Disney when we look at, all these, the fantasy of it. We look at marriage when we look at the fantasy, but I think the generations now know to be discussing prenuptial planning early on. But what happens is in the moment when we have the younger generation meeting people and wanting to settle down, then their refrain is, well, don't you trust me? Don't you trust my choice? It's not about trust. It's not about that at all. And so I agree with you. In order to create that continuum of protection through the generations, it means having an advisor or an advisory team that can look at the parents and the grandparents' trust interests and dissect them and take a look at how those trusts might be vulnerable or very protective in connection with the potential for a future divorce among somebody in a generation far from the settlor of the trust. The settlors don't plan it that way, but it's not too late to plan. We now have decanting in Massachusetts. So, for example, in one of my matters right now, I'm assisting a family by looking at their trust planning. They have multiple trusts, and I'm reviewing it for marital exclusion language that says that spouses who are divorcing don't have entitlement. And it has, of course, spendthrift clauses, ascertainable standards, all the different features and attributes of a trust that may actually either protect it or create some exposure and vulnerability in divorce. And I'm taking a look at all the language in the trusts and looking at it against recent case law and advising the leading generations about estate planning changes that they might want to make, because it's not too late to do so now that we have decanting as an option. And for those people listening or watching later on who don't know what decanting is and don't have a chance to ask, decanting is a situation where you take assets from one trust and you pour it into a newly created trust, just like you would decant wine out of a bottle. You're decanting assets into a new trust structure. And by doing this, you can amend unamendable irrevocable trusts. And you can do so to change significant provisions. You can do so to change beneficiaries. You could potentially remove beneficiaries. You can add language that you didn't know at the time that you drafted that you might later need in that trust, that you would only learn from hindsight after reading some legal cases that have been decided long after the trust was settled and created and funded. So decanting is an extraordinarily powerful tool. So I'm taking a look at the family trusts and analyzing trusts that go back years and years through multiple generations and identifying where there may be exposure if a subsequent generation, the next generation, either has a prenuptial agreement that's attacked and declared unenforceable, or chooses not to have a prenuptial agreement at all. And the nice thing about this is that it allows both generations, or all, the entire continuum of generations, to see that we're doing work throughout and that there's a continuum here for a shared purpose, a common goal. And in doing this work together, we're able to overcome some difficult conversations that relate to transparency, disclosure of assets. We get up and over the "don't you trust me" concept or the blame concept. It's not about that. Suddenly the conversation turns to stewardship. And how can we protect what we have for our next generation? So I'm doing a lot of the decanting work. We had some wonderful cases through the years, but most importantly, Massachusetts has the Ferry versus Powell Ferry case, where the trustees actually went into court in a strategic way right after the in-law had filed for divorce, and went into court, the trustees, and they asked the court to permit and ratify decanting that they had already done. They were very quick to decant to protect the family. And they went right ahead. As soon as the divorce was filed, they went right ahead and decanted immediately and went to the court afterwards and said, "This is what we did. Please ratify it, bless it, give it the okay, your stamp of approval." And the court did. I don't know if the court would have done that, anything like that, if too much time had passed, or if the decanting was done without seeking court approval. I think then the in-law would have brought an action saying that this was a fraudulent step or a tactical step, but it was done with such strategic finesse that it worked. There was a case that didn't work. It was decided just last year in 2020 in New Hampshire. It was the Hodges case, and that one didn't work. In that situation, the grantor had set up a trust. He brought a blended family into his life. He met a woman, and she had 3 children from her prior marriage. He had 2 children from his prior marriage, and the trust was there to protect all of them. The relationships really what soured. The relationship soured, and he did some decanting that was aimed at taking certain people out of the trust, and he took his stepchildren out first, his wife second, then he took some of his own kids out, and the trustees were decanting left and right from 2007 through 2013. There was a lot of decanting going on. And the trustees were determined by the court to have not used impartiality in their decisions. And so the New Hampshire court, unlike the Massachusetts court, said, "No, this will not stand. We can't let this happen." So all of this is to say that there are remedies. It can be done the right way, but it's a conversation that should be had by the entire family so that people understand the continuity of it. And decanting can be an excellent strategic tool if it's used properly to protect family wealth with stewardship goals for the next generation.
Lisa, just one follow-up. You mentioned transparency. And, if you sort of think about it, is it all transparent all the time? Or how do you advise, particularly on the subjects that you were just talking about, where it's the right level of transparency, and particularly when talking with that leading generation, when it's a bridge too far?
Yeah,
Yes.
This is a hot topic, especially around wealth too, and kind of disclosing that. So Lisa, I'd love to hear your perception on this.
Thank you. That's got to be the hardest issue. I have had clients come to me for whom transparency and disclosure of asset levels to their children and their children's future spouse carries such an emotionally impactful feeling of threat that they say, isn't there a trust solution instead? Isn't there a private trust solution instead of this? I really don't want to be disclosing. And I understand that, we have children. We want our children to have a fire in their belly. We don't want to disclose the value of assets to our kids. We want them to recognize, you think of all the paradigms and the idioms, money doesn't grow on trees, and you've got to work hard. It's a good work ethic, and that's what we want for our children. So we raise our children not disclosing the value of the assets, and we raise them with a sense of stewardship for the next generation, all without making these disclosures. And it feels terribly threatening to have to make these disclosures for the first time when a new in-law is about to come into the family. There's almost an allergy to it, if you will. And so it creates great disharmony and great threat. Money has such emotional meaning for people. So what I like to do is find a strategic way to make disclosures. And of course, in a prenuptial agreement, they're supposed to be fair and reasonable, which means that in order for the agreement to be enforceable when you need it most, meaning either at the death of a family member or at the divorce of a family member, in order for it to be enforceable at that time, it needs to be fair and reasonable, meaning the person who is giving up assets needs to know what they're giving up. If they're going to waive rights, they need to know what they're waiving before they sign on the line. And that means disclosure. And there needs to be a disclosure statement. But what I'll do is I'll work with the families to develop a strategic disclosure, and I'll work with opposing counsel. If the attorneys, and by the way, in a prenup, there needs to be an attorney for each spouse, there must be, and it's called opposing counsel. The process is supposed to be negotiated, just like you would negotiate any contract, with each party being on a separate side, if you will, even though there's much love here. And so the process should be respectful, it should be elegant, but it should be fiercely smart and aggressively smart. And so in that vein, what we try to do is we make disclosures that are strategic, that may not just blatantly list a value. Of course, values will change, but they might list certain features and attributes of the trust as well, to enable an understanding that perhaps there's a certain asset level there, but there's a class of beneficiaries that presently, has 30 people in it and is set to open even more and expand, meaning that the interests might be so remote that at the end of the day, there may not be anything there, or it may not be that significant. So we can create a strategic disclosure that allows optically for us to move forward with a fair and reasonable full disclosure agreement, but one that doesn't disclose too much. So there are ways to do it. And I'd imagine for you too, you probably have quite the struggle and quite the work ahead of you to work with the leadership of the family to disclose enough information so that the next generation can make meaningful, informed decisions. They need information to participate, but I can see how the same issues that I deal with are issues that you deal with. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Caleb, if you want to chime in. I think it's just, it has become apparent to me through our conversation that oftentimes these critical conversations come at a moment of transition, which is already kind of ripe for a lot of challenge emotionally, in addition to kind of the need to disclose information. And so I think part of our work is to kind of figure out what the right structure for communication is. We sometimes do that through family meetings where we make sure that everyone gets consistent information across the board. Well, we do have to be cautious based on age, stage, and other factors. How much is given to people and when. So Caleb, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I'm sure you do.
Well, yes. I mean, every family is different. Every member of that family is different. We do, Caitlin talked a bit before about the use of scenarios in an effort to sort of drive choice. And you can be pretty creative, either making a scenario really close to home or maybe a little bit more distant, so that what it allows, depending on the audience and depending on just how much one wants to disclose, it can get information out there, and see reaction, and then one builds from there. In general, it is, what you don't want, and we've seen this a few times, is for a leading generation to make assumptions that the next generation has absolutely no interest whatsoever, only to find at the 11th hour at a sale, or even after a sale, that there becomes all sorts of resentment because the conversation never took place. So, transitions, really require a lot of pre-planning. So what we try to do is raise the kinds of questions that have people think about the future, and a couple of the choices and scenarios that could help foster conversations across the family.
I think that's critical, because without those conversations, there could be internal rivalries and internal upsets that can be a disruption, and one that is either unforeseeable or foreseeable. I am painfully aware of many families that have dealt with internal discord and upset and influence, where perhaps it's somebody on the inside who's upset. There's rivalries, there's squeezing out. I serve as trustee for a gentleman who decided with his brothers that he would be bought out, and it worked for everybody, worked for the good. Everybody felt much more comfortable this way. But there are situations where there's internal rivalries. So the conversations that you're talking about are so important. There's such a balance between transparency, disclosure, and maintaining a sense of confidentiality and a stepwise gradualness to disclosure. It's definitely a sensitive issue, no doubt. Before we go further, let me check in and see if we have any questions. Christina, can you let us know if we have any questions that we should answer before we move forward?
Not seeing any right now.
Okay, then I think I will go forward and just ask you both, have you seen internal strife and internal rivalries? How do you manage that to avoid litigation? I know what happens when it turns into litigation, and I know some legal ways to manage that and settle it. But how do you work with families internally that are feeling polarized so that you can avoid that internal family upset that comes from rivalry?
Well, I'll take the first crack at that, and then by all means, Caitlin, jump in. I will say sometimes we are not successful, right? Sometimes, unfortunately, despite our interventions and pulling in the help of others, things do lead to litigation. But we do try to shift that and diffuse that. And one of the ways we do that is what we call interest analysis. And it's so often the first thing that shows up is positions that people have taken, and they seem very dug in, right? And so a lot of the work we do is to sort of pull back from, if you almost imagine a picture of an iceberg, right? And all people are seeing is the very tip of that iceberg. And that's the position that says, I will never sell this business, or I will never give it pass on shares, or I will, whatever it might be, I'll never invest in whatever, depending on whether we're talking a family business or a family office. And what we try to do is unpack, well, what sits under that position that's showing? What are the interests? How, and what we often find is that there's more alignment than family members might think. And yes, there are differences, but how can those differences actually be not only unpacked, but then where there are differences, can you go at a high enough level to see where, the different goals of that are coming across as differences can actually be sort of arrayed across a spectrum, and maybe there's some middle ground before one necessarily gets to litigation. The other thing is, by showing just what litigation might do to ruin unmistakably the family harmony and make it a point of no return, we do make sure that that is a scenario that we put in front of people, as uncomfortable as that is. Caitlin, what might you add?
Yeah, I know that was a good, I think the values and the vision obviously like can be a central point to come back to. It's, sometimes it's too far removed. The behaviors are too divisive in those situations. But if something to come back to, that can be a helpful platform to put on the table. I think also you have to have everyone at the table. You need to have the right folks in the right conversation together. And some of our work, to be honest, leading up to some of these kind of interventions, as you call them, is just getting people to have the conversations that they need to have, knowing that if they don't have them, the problem doesn't go away, it becomes more complex, and that by having those initial conversations, that's the starting point. Bring your seat to the table, sit down, and let's have a conversation about this while we still can, while it's not so far blown. So easier said than done, but a lot of personal individual work goes into those situations, and where we're not successful, it's usually because someone doesn't want to participate in figuring that out, and then it ends up in litigation. So
Yes, it does. In my litigation work, before we ever file a complaint, we do ask for a sit down where we will sit and talk, and at various junctures in litigation, we discuss settlement. Mm-hmm. And mediation. The value of mediation is great, and I know that I've mediated my share of cases and private adjudicated my share of cases where attorneys representing families, enterprising families, will come to me and ask me to make some informal decisions that will help the family to do some contracting, some non-judicial settlement agreement type contracting, so that they're making agreements that everybody can weigh in on. Maybe they're doing some shared estate planning together, and we're keeping it out of the court in the first place by doing some settlement agreements on our own or some contracting. And so I enjoy that role a lot, whether I'm representing a family, an individual, or actually serving as a private adjudicator or conciliator or mediator. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful role, and it's very helpful to families.
Well, yeah, and we'll also, in this family constitution that we've referred to a couple times, we'll usually build in a family conflict section of the Constitution that outlines kind of what's the best process for resolving something between two individual parties. Bring it to the conversation quickly, do it within a certain amount of time, and then what are the escalation? What's the escalation? What's the next level? Bring in someone like Lisa to have a conversation as needed. Even having that release valve of having the ability to talk to someone like you, Lisa, or another person in their trusted advisor network can sometimes release the pressure so much that people kind of resolve it on their own. But we do build a lot of family conflict kind of language and structures into the family constitution in collaboration with the family, so they know exactly what they're signing up for and they can shape the process. So.
Yes, that's wonderful that you've got the family constitution. I think that really makes all the difference, and that's the value add. It's the family roles and the norms and values and the family mission that creates a structure for stabilization of power in the family. And, we've seen such destabilizing forces over the past year, and we all had concern about destabilizing market fluctuation. We didn't so much see the market fluctuation as we did just a shifting in the atmospherics of business, a shifting in the nature of business, the type of business. We saw very unanticipated, adverse, and beneficial business events over the past year. All of this has impacted the sturdiness and stability of family dynamics, no more so than in a family business. It's been quite a 15-month period, and one that's left an indelible mark. I see that we're coming very close to the end of our time, and so I would like to thank you both. Let us know, and let those people who are listening today and those who are watching our recorded webinar after the fact, let everybody know how they can reach you.
So we can be reached at our website is www.cfar.com. And all our contact information is there. You'll see case histories. You'll see the kind of work we do, not only in family businesses and owner-led businesses and enterprises, but also some of our other practices in higher education and healthcare and associations.
Yes,
Terrific.
and thank you so much, Lisa, for this opportunity. It's been fun to partner with you through the planning for this session and also in the conversation itself. As you said, this is going to be really fun, and it was. So thank you, Lisa.
And
You're so welcome.
I certainly think we'll have future family constitutions that have that conflict. 1-800 call Lisa.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I like that. I like that. It'd be a great logo for me. 1-800 call Lisa is perfect. I want to thank you both. It's been really lovely having you as guests on the Business of Family webinar. I'm Lisa Cuquier. I'm with Burns and Levinson. We produce a Business of Family webinar every month. This is episode 6, and we look forward to seeing you at episode 7. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I can be reached by cell at 617-966-9582. Otherwise, you can find us online and email us that way through Burns and Levinson. Thank you all. It's been a wonderful episode.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.